Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel and another video. In this week's video, I will show you what I consider to be the most difficult but also the most satisfying build thus far in my woodworking journey. So in this video, you'll see some things go well, but you'll also see some things go absolutely terrible. Despite those terrible things, I was somehow able to put these two slabs together to make a book-matched live edge walnut table that I think turned out fantastic. So the starting steps of this table obviously will be to get two slabs. So these are black walnut book match slabs, meaning that they're cut from the same tree. One would be a cross section right on top of the other piece as they're cut. And these slabs are absolutely massive, as you can see me struggling to move these around. So they're about 9.5 feet long, a full 12 inches thick, and each slab weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of between 1 and 2 billion pounds. So the concept of building this table is actually pretty simple. All we really need to do is flatten both slabs, rip a good edge on each of the slabs so they can be joined together to make one big slab, apply some finish, bolt the steel legs on the underside, and that should finish up the table. Nice and simple, right? So as I mentioned, the first step in this table build is to flatten each one of the slabs. And because these slabs are so big, they won't fit through my planer, and the only way that I'm able to do this is using my router sled. The router sled works to flatten these slabs by placing the router in a little carriage that slides across two linear rails on the same plane. And with this sled, we can make several passes over the slabs, taking maybe a couple millimeters off each time to get those slabs nice and flat on one side. While the router sled does take quite a bit of time to flatten these slabs out, it actually works very well. After we flip the slab over, it's easy to see that the bottom profile of the slab matches the tabletop, which is exactly what we want. We will then flatten the other side the exact same way, which will become parallel to the first surface we smoothed out with the router. Obviously, we will need to do this on both slabs, and another important piece is we need to get these slabs as close to the same thickness as we can. Otherwise, our tabletop will end up looking like one of those uneven pavement road signs. After what seemed like way too much time, we finally had both of these slabs flattened on both sides. And if you've never heard of book match pieces before, here is a great look at what a book match slab or book match piece looks like. And the main interest in using book match slabs is that the slabs are essentially a mirror image of each other, which will really make this table that much more interesting. So I needed to lay the slabs out and see which live edge I wanted to cut off. I'm just using two tape measures as straight edges, and everything between the tape measures on both orientations of the slab will be the section that I cut out, leaving that opposite live edge. Eventually, I decided to go with the first orientation of the slabs, mainly because there was a knot right up at the top section of the slab that I thought would look better on the inside, but also I liked the way the grain lined up a little better this way. So getting a perfect cut seam on this edge that I'm ripping here will be a problem we'll encounter a little later in the video, but for right now, I just needed to rough cut that opposite live edge off so I could run these things through the drum sander, which will help to smooth out the surfaces left over from the router sled. Although this did work, I'm not entirely happy with how the drum sander performs on slabs this big. So if you are considering a similar setup for the purposes of slabs, I am not sure that I would recommend what I did. Regardless, I was able to get each of the slabs relatively close to the same thickness, somewhere right around a thickness difference of 1/100 of an inch or so, which for me is close enough. With our slab smoothed out and perfectly flat on two sides, we can now focus our attention to the edge joint of each piece of these slabs. My track saw unfortunately won't plunge deep enough to make the full cut in one pass, so I slightly offset the second cut with the track saw, then flip the slab over, attempting to clean up that edge with a flush cut trim bit and my router. In theory, this should work perfectly, but as you saw in that up close shot a second ago, there were some edges and some uneven lines on each of the joints of these slabs. And when I pushed the slabs together, the joint was okay, but okay is certainly not going to cut it for this table. Typically, you will use a joiner to get perfect seams between two boards you're gluing together. And although it is obvious that these slabs are way too big for my joiner, I had to give this a shot just to see if I could get that good edge. But because these slabs were so big, I wasn't able to properly balance them up against the fence. So I tried joining a perfectly flat edge on a 2x6, once again going back to the flush cut trim bit method to copy that profile onto the slabs. However, this also did not work, meaning we are 0 for 3 on attempts to get this joint ready for a glue up. What finally did end up working was to clamp each of these slabs down with these fancy clamps that look a lot like dumbbells, and then use the track saw to re-rip that line right down the middle where the two slabs are touching. The idea being that any difference between the seams of the slabs will be ripped out with the track saw, which should make the joint seams line up. We'll use the flush cut trim bit on the router one last time to cut off the additional depth, giving us a nice seam in the middle that finally lined up and was far better than anything else I had tried. At this point, our top, bottom, and joint surfaces are all good to go. All we need to do is to put some dominoes between the seams to make sure that these pieces will stay together during the glue up. And while the dominoes are typically only used for alignment purposes, these will add some strength to that internal joint seam, at least until the glue on both of those faces is dry. I will admit that this was one of the more difficult glue ups I've ever done. Between the 8 internal dominoes having to line up, the slab weighing 500,000 pounds, and trying to somehow put clamps across this thing without tearing up the live edge on each side, I was definitely holding my breath a bit on hoping that this glue up would turn out okay. The absolute most important part of this glue up is to make sure that the surface of these slabs remain flat across the width of these slabs. Luckily, the glue up turned out nearly perfect as far as the flatness goes. However, the middle glue up seam did have a tiny hairpin crack, which is no big deal for us because we will make our own wood filler to make that crack completely disappear. If you've never made your own wood filler, it's a fairly simple process. All you do is take some sawdust from the same species of wood that you're using, a little bit of glue and mix it up to make a paste, and then that paste can be forced right down in that crack. Sometimes I'll put some of the sawdust in the crack first, and then you can just take a squeegee or a brush or whatever to get all of that paste right down in the crack. This filler is for cosmetic purposes only, so if you have a bad joint, that won't help the joint with the structure or stability any. This is instead just a quick trick to hide any of the imperfections on your glue seam. So after we have that sanded out, you can see the crack here completely disappears, and you almost can't even tell where the two slabs are joined together. While that center seam joint can be cleaned up with our DIY sawdust, there's a lot of cracks on the edges of these tables that there's no way that I'd be able to fill these with sawdust. So instead we will have to fill those cracks with epoxy, but before we can move on to the epoxy pour, we need to first seal the outside edges of the slab. That way the epoxy will stay in the slab and not end up on the floor. So the comment about preventing epoxy from getting on the floor is a little foreshadowing as to what we will see later in the video, but basically to seal up these edges I first needed to cut as flat of an edge as I could, so I did that with the track saw and then sanded down the excess off. The outside edges, as you can see, weren't perfect, but that's okay because really we just need to seal the outside edge. This very end piece will be cut off when we flush cut the tabletop later, so all we need to do is seal up the gap so those cracks won't leak epoxy whenever we do pour it in. Both slabs had a knot right in the center, so I had to put some tape on the underside of that. If you have to crawl underneath a slab that weighs about 300 pounds, it's always a great idea to balance it on a flimsy trash can. Which brings us to the real star of the show and today's video sponsor, which is Brute Trash Cans. Yeah, that's entirely not true because this is a woodworking video. And a trash can company surprisingly doesn't have a whole lot of interest in advertising on a woodworking channel. Anyway, with the slab back up on the table, I cleaned out both of those knots. And then it was time for a little epoxy. So it's pretty simple. All you do is pour it in the knots and hope that that tape on the underside held up so it doesn't leak out everywhere. Hint, hint as to what will happen later on in the video. And I don't know if it's something I'm doing wrong or I just need more practice with epoxy, but I find this stuff pretty difficult to work with. You pour it in the crack and it seems to go everywhere except where you want it. So you have to work with it a little bit until you can finally force all of that down in the crack. So this is the next day after that epoxy was dry, and at this point in the video you probably think you're watching Blacktail Studio because this looks so good. But I can assure you that you are still watching the same video and your screen didn't accidentally click over to one of Cam's videos. Now if you couldn't tell by the enthusiasm in my voice, I was being completely sarcastic and I thought that this looked terrible. I was actually pretty concerned that I had ruined the surface, spilling the epoxy everywhere. So really at this point all I could do was to grab my sander and try to sand all of this epoxy out level with the rest of the surface. And I wasn't necessarily worried that the cracks wouldn't be filled, but more so that the epoxy would have bled over into the wood grain around where I poured it, maybe staining the tabletop or leaving some discoloration. So I water popped it and you can see that there is some staining on there. I was concerned at this point, but this ended up sanding out perfectly fine later and did not thankfully cause a problem. So at this point we have one end of the table looking pretty good. On the other side, however, there are some forks where the tree originally split at the top, leaving us with some rotten sections that we would next have to deal with. So I know what you're thinking, that being, why didn't you just cross-cut it a little shorter? And I suppose I could have done that, which would have made it much simpler. But the recipient of this table asked for a table that was 8 feet long. And for this table to be 8 feet long, I had to keep a little bit of those voids on there. Now looking back, it probably would have been okay to make this table 7 foot 8 inches, but they asked for this table to be 8 feet, so I wanted to deliver an 8-foot table. So my game plan here was to cut out all of the dead wood with my Dremel and whatever other tools that I could get my hands on that seemed to work, and then fill these holes up with epoxy in hopes that these 2 epoxy spots on one end would add a really cool feature to the table. In the end, I was very happy with how this turned out and I think it looked great. But anyway, we have to first cut out all of that dead wood. And because the slabs were book matched, I had to clean out the bad side on opposite ends of the slab. And this is where the real fun started because this thing was nearly impossible to flip over. I tried flipping it over on the workbench, but I was more worried about setting it down than lifting it up. So it ended up working out best to flip it end for end very slowly to get to that other side. It turned out that the void on this side of the slab was even worse than that other side. So once again, using the combo of some chisels, the drill, the Dremel, whatever else I could find, and some willpower, I finally, after forever, cleaned out all of that garbage wood to get this thing prepped and ready for a little more epoxy action. So the surface we are looking at is the bottom of the tabletop. And obviously we have to secure some type of form to the bottom side so that epoxy can set down and have somewhere to go and take shape. And at this point, pretty much everything that could go wrong is going to go wrong over the next couple minutes in the video. But anyway, my thought process was to secure a piece of melamine to the bottom side with some liquid nails caulking and then flip this thing over. Watching back on this now, I have absolutely no idea why I thought I would be able to flip this over and have that piece stay clamped in place. I ended up almost dropping the slab, knocking a bunch of stuff over, broke a clamp completely in half. And best of all, when I finally got the slab spun around to the other place of where I wanted it, that sheet didn't stay in place, came undone, got the liquid nails caulking everywhere, and honestly, I felt pretty defeated and a bit frustrated at this point. So I didn't show it, but I lifted the slab back up and emptied another tube of caulking down underneath it, and then I cut a second piece of the form board off to clamp and attach to the outside of this, which would create that little pool or pocket where the epoxy would go. I left the slab just a bit too long so that I could attach this form board with screws, and when I take this back out, I'll cut that section off. That way the screw holes will be completely cut off and they won't be seen. So I got the dumbbell clamps back out in order to hold that slab in place while that caulking dried, or should I say, while I thought the caulking dried. And then 2 days later, I came back and added some epoxy to that voids to fill in the gaps where we have. So there were 2 holes. You can see the epoxy on this first hole looks pretty good. I need a little bit more in there. But when we go over to this second hole, there is some epoxy remaining, but a lot of the epoxy that was supposed to be in there ended up down on the floor and my workbench and all over the place. So one more time in case I wasn't clear enough, the epoxy that's supposed to be in there is down on the floor. One thing that I noticed when cleaning some of this up is that the epoxy had started to cure and was much more viscous, so I hoped that wherever the leak was on the bottom of the slab would slowly cure up, since that epoxy would run out right to the surface of where the crack is. So rather than clean it all up and take it apart, I just poured more epoxy right down in it. And to my surprise, with finally a little luck on my side, wherever the crack was sealed up and the epoxy did go to the top of the surface just like it should. I wasn't able to break or take the form off of the outside, so like I mentioned earlier, I did leave the slab a little long so I could just cut that piece off with a track saw. And then thankfully I was able to break the slab free from the form below. As far as I can think, this is also the first time I've ever used a crowbar in my project, which is another first for me. When I tried to pull that bottom form board off, there was another surprise waiting, and I really wasn't sure what this was, but one thing that I knew was that it did not look good. So we flipped the slab over so we can take an up-close look at what happened and take a look at this. I'm really not sure what word to use to describe how I felt when I found this complete mess of a mix of epoxy and caulking underneath this. But what I was sure about was that this was a problem and I would need to clean up as much of this as possible. So what happened, I guess, was that the liquid nails caulking obviously didn't cure and was still wet whenever I poured the epoxy in there, causing them to mix and leak and get everywhere, all over the table and up in the slab as well. So I tried to cut as much of this out with a chisel and some hand tools as I could, but ended up using a spiral bit on the router. To my surprise, I was able to get almost every single bit of that caulking out of there, and then I sanded out the excess residue that was left over around that void. So we'll come back and touch that up with some more epoxy, but for the moment I wanted to get as far away from anything related to epoxy as possible. So I grabbed the belt sander and started to sand that underside. A lot of times I'll use the underside on my tabletops as practice to see how my sanding technique looks, as well as what the stain color will look like. But anyway, with the bottom section sanded and that epoxy void repaired, we could focus our attention on the live edges of this tabletop. Working on those live edges is an easy process, thankfully, and nothing will go wrong here. So I'm just using the Restorer drum sander with a couple different attachments to get those live edges good. I tried to get the surfaces nice and smooth, but also leave some of that contrast and detail. There were a couple wormholes on the edges, which looked really cool, so I left those on there as well. So the epoxy is cured and all of the cracks and holes are filled except for a couple tiny little cracks we'll address later, but at this point I can finally cut the table to size. I do so with the track saw followed by the flush trim router bit, which will get that bottom section that the track saw can't reach nice and flat. I think it's hard to argue that these live edge tabletops don't make for an incredibly unique piece of furniture. But despite their uniqueness, they do have their own set of challenges. One challenge unique to these tabletops is that they are subject to warping and wood movement over time. These two slabs have been properly kiln dried, but because of the nature of the grain orientation being flat sawn, we need to reinforce them up underneath with some C-channels in order to keep them from warping or bending, as they do expand and contract with seasonal temperature and humidity changes. So the C-channel is made from thick gauge steel, and because it is shaped like a C, there's no way that it can bend, meaning that if we inlay it up under the underside of the tabletop, it should be able to keep those slabs flat. So we use the router to cut parallel grooves for the rails of the C-channel to sit down in. And then the C-channel has multiple elongated slots across the length of the C-channel, which we will mark and then drill out holes to put threaded inserts, which will mount some furniture bolts from the outside of the C-channel down into. The C-channel needs to have these elongated slots to allow for expansion and contraction of the slab, and after we have everything sanded back down and cleaned up, we can put them in place. And this is the part of the video where I'll do some things out of order as to what you would normally see. Starting with putting finish on the bottom of the surface. I wanted to have the finish on first before I put those C-channels in place so that the finish wouldn't get all over them. Just using Rubio Monocoat on the bottom. We'll talk more about this on the top here briefly in the video. But after the finish was on the bottom, I can bolt those C-channels in place using furniture bolts. And if you are doing this, one thing you want to remember is to not over tighten these bolts. You should have them snug to keep everything in place, but you do not want to over tighten them, as over tightening them will prevent wood movement. These are the steel legs that I'll be using on this table. These came from a website, I believe, which is called Menominee Specialty Lumber. I will put a link to the description on that if you are interested in these legs. But anyway, these legs will be bolted in place similar to how we did those C-channels. So I first centered them up to where I wanted, then used a drill bit to mark where each one of the holes would go. While the holes on the legs were not elongated for wood movement, they were oversized so that if there is any expansion and contraction, those holes should allow for it. So normally you should put finish on both sides of your tabletop at the same time, but because this slab was so big and so heavy and I still needed to do work on the bottom, it really wasn't possible for me to flip that over and not worry about disturbing the finish on one of the sides. Luckily, there seemed to be no warping or bending of the slab whatsoever, so maybe I just got lucky this time, but it seemed to work out for me okay. To get this slab ready for finish, we will kiss all of the edges with a round over bit, and then I sanded and sanded and sanded this tabletop through all the grits from 120 all the way up to 220, water popping the surface in between each grit, and even doing a little hand sanding on the edges as well. After we clean the tabletop off with some compressed air, we can go on to the actual finish. For this, I'm using Rubio Monocoat Pure. Rubio looks fantastic on walnut and is very easy to use. If you watch my channel frequently, you know I am a huge fan of Rubio. Anyway, after the Rubio is on, I like to go back over with this polisher buffer type thing and make sure that all of that finish is actually spread out through the tabletop and I didn't miss any spots. And then you'll go back over with a cloth and wipe all the excess off. Normally I don't do multiple coats of Rubio, but because of the quality I was aiming for on this tabletop, I wanted to do a second coat. So I sanded the surface gently with a maroon pad, and unfortunately I noticed a couple of spots that didn't look all that great. In fact, they looked pretty awful, and I knew that this wasn't going to cut it for the table. These spots were much more apparent in the black epoxy, and unfortunately there is no way to spot treat these. I tried a couple different things, but nothing worked, so the only way that I could fix this was to go back and sand the entire surface off and redo the finish. Luckily for me, sanding is a ton of fun. I only used 1 or 2 sanding pads, and Rubio is pretty cheap, so this wasn't really a big deal to have to redo the surface. And sarcastic jokes aside, regardless of how much fun it wasn't to redo, the surface simply was not good enough the first time because I got lazy on the detailed work. I'm not certain, but I think the issue was that there were air bubbles in that epoxy as it cured. So I cut the top surface off with the spiral bit like I did earlier, re-poured the epoxy, and then used a lighter to make sure that all the air bubbles were out. I did have to baby these spots, but I finally got them nice and smooth without any air bubbles. Another problem area was all of those cracks that I put epoxy in earlier, so I tried cleaning them out with mineral spirits, and then the slow and tedious process of fixing every one of these tiny little pinholes began. So I used a mixture of epoxy, Starbond, thin Starbond, literally everything that I could try to get all these holes filled. This process took forever, and I did not realize and severely underestimated how much time and effort the detail work would take on this. No matter what I did, it seemed like whenever I would fill these holes, regardless of what I used, every time that I would wait for it to dry and then sand back over it, the sander would just cut everything back out and I would have that hole left wide open again. What finally did end up working for me was to put some Starbond on those pinholes and then use a thick paintbrush to kind of stab the Starbond down into the holes. Ultimately, I was able to get all of those pinholes filled in and was happy with the result. It just took a lot more time than I would have hoped for. What you're looking at here is the residue and sawdust left over from the tabletop after cleaning it with mineral spirits. I didn't clean it with mineral spirits the first time I did the finish, but I wanted to make sure this second round was completely flawless. So again, I went through all of the sanding grits, cleaning in between each grit with mineral spirits and a couple water pops. And then we could just do the Rubio Monocoat finishing process one more time. Here's a first look after that finish is on, and from this angle you can see why walnut is such a great choice for tabletops like this. After that finish is on, we will buff it down with a maroon pad again. This time it looked much better than that previous time, and I was really glad that I decided to redo the finish instead of passing it off as good enough. But you buff it out to a uniform finish, clean the surface off as much as possible, and then we can put a second coat of finish on just like we did that first coat earlier. A couple days later, before that finish is completely cured, we will go back and add some Rubio maintenance oil. This is done the same exact way as the finish. This just adds a little extra sheen and makes it look that much better. Once the finish is cured, we can put the legs on the underside of the table. This is done by running big furniture bolts through the legs up into those threaded inserts we put on. And I used some longer furniture bolts, which made this thing absolutely rock solid after I had the legs on. We are finally almost finished with this table, but the very last thing I wanted to do was add some extra protection to the top. So I am using the Blacktail Studio N3 Nano Finish. If you want more information on this product, you can check that out on the Blacktail Studio website. But anyway, I was a little hesitant to use this on this table as I had never done so before, but this product is incredibly easy to work with. And finally, after all of that work and all of the difficulties we had, this table was finally finished. So here are some glamour shots of this table. I could not be happier with how this thing turned out. This was such an incredible opportunity for me to be able to do this. I've been wanting to do one of these tables forever. So if you did make it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you think of this table. Definitely feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay tuned for more.